All right, so I'm very pleased today to introduce Gabrielle, Krawiek, a graduate from here in 2013, which was just yesterday. Gabby has a BA in Environmental Studies and in Geology, so a double major. She's a local from Canisteo. She has representatives here to support. And not long after she graduated here, she ended up working for LaBella. What's the full name of it?
LaBella Associates.
LaBella Associates. They have offices in multiple locations, including in Rochester. So Gabby works out of the Rochester office. And over time, so we connected on LinkedIn fairly quickly when you started there. So it's been fun to see like the little notifications that you got promoted something, so you went from field technician to phase one projects person to project manager in 2016. And now there's a department of phase one due diligence, which we'll talk about today. And she runs that department. So it's really fun to see that progression. And before I give you the floor, just a reminder that next week there's no talk. It's the last Friday before fall break. Nobody shows up anyway when that happens. So no talk next week. But the week after that, we start again. With that, I'm gonna fiddle with the lights here and this goes to just hook that up somewhere.
All right. Hi, everyone. This is a little intimidating because I'm usually used to being on your side and not down here. But yeah, my name is Gabrielle Krawiek. I go by Gabby. And as Fred kind of did a quick introduction, I graduated with a BA in Environmental Studies and Geology back in 2013. Some fun facts. I was a captain of the women's soccer team here in 2012 and 2013. And the best class I ever took that I still use every day is hydrogeology, even though I did accidentally fall asleep during my final because I was up all night. And the hardest class I ever took, anyone else who's a geology major may know, structural geology was probably the hardest class I ever took. I currently work at LaBella Associates and I live in Rochester, New York. So just a quick agenda of what I'm going to be talking about today. Quick overview of the company that I work for. Some history, why due diligence is a thing nowadays. A due diligence overview. What is a phase one? What is a phase two? And then hopefully, if I have enough time, a quick case study. So LaBella Associates is a full-service architecture and engineering firm. We are located in 36 different offices, ranging from Maine down to South Carolina, over into Alabama, Tennessee, Ohio. We have an office in Spain, and we also have an office just recently in Scotland. Unfortunately, I've never done any environmental work in Spain or Scotland, but fingers crossed they'll let me go. Our projects include building, energy, infrastructure, and of course, the environment. We focus on building better communities, and our slogan is, we are powered by partnership. So the environmental movement really kind of began, as you all know, really in the 1960s and 70s. Heavy industry occurred back in the late 1800s with mass production in technologies and electricity. And really, people started to get concerned in the 60s and 70s. So this is just a nice little graph that we created showing why people were starting to care. 1970 was the first Earth Day. The US EPA was formed in 1970 to protect the human health and the environment. There are currently 10 regions in the states, and they work to develop and enforce regulations. They provide grants for workforce development, for cleanup and remediation, for multiple different things. They also provide lots of different types of research, and they partner with private companies, state and local governments, nonprofits. The EPA does work with us to do education, so information, and also studies. The environmental laws, I'm sure all the environmental students know this, but the Clean Air Act in 1963, the Clean Water Act in 1972, Resource Conservation Recreation in 1976, and then the one that I really fall under is the CERCLA Superfund site that was created in 1980. So what led to the national problem called brownfields, right? So in 1980, as we all know, there's a fun thing called the Love Canal out in Buffalo, New York. And that kind of caused a frenzy of issues with the polluters pay principle and the potential responsibilities parties, which we like to call in my world PRPs. Caused lots of different issues of who was going to clean this up, who was going to pay for it, how were they going to clean it up, what standards were they going to use. So a big thing that really took place was this massive court case called the Fleet Factor case, where lenders who were providing developers and private citizens money to redevelop their properties, when someone said that they would do, they weren't able to clean something up, it actually fell back on the funders who had the money to pay for it. So this was a huge case, and it influenced a lot of property management, saying that they could be liable for the cleanup. And this is where phase ones and site assessments for due diligence really became part of and started a business. It really started because banks and lenders were like, we don't want to be paying for these things because they're so expensive. And this can be found in a lot of really old cities, real estate values, transportation systems. You know, when there's issues with environmental, we see an increase in crime because they're dilapidated buildings. People don't want to live in that area. There's tax issues and business downturns. So there's a lot of things that kind of echo after an environmental issues at a property. So very briefly, government concepts for brownfields and environmental due diligence. The national, federal government and states, there's the US EPA who is in charge of creating all the regulations. And then it falls down to state departments to ensure that those regulations are being followed, as long as other environmental topics that are specific to the state. I want you to kind of think of PFAS. That's a big issue now in New York State that was just created in 2020, I think. And then also these regulations and policies are followed with state agencies like the New York State DEC. The brownfield property cycle. So this really is like an overview of what I do, and I promise I'm going to get to it. But so step one is a property owner is unwilling to clean up his property because it's just too much. It costs too much, or he doesn't want to deal with it. So then the property becomes vacant and dilapidated, and tax foreclosures occur. So municipalities either take it because there's been lots of arson or illegal dumping that occurs, or vandalism. So the building really kind of brings down the neighborhood. A lot of times with these type of sites, there's contamination. And when I say contamination, I'm talking about dirty dirt and dirty groundwater underneath a building or in an area that is expanding and affecting the other areas surrounding that property, which causes property values to decline because nobody wants to live in a contaminated area. And so what the brownfield program does is it allows developers with lots of money to come in with investors and actually pay to clean up these in a reasonable manner. Obviously, the property becomes worse the longer that it's just sitting there. How big is the problem? Just to kind of give you guys an idea how bad or how many real estate issues or properties or brownfields in the country. This year, the US EPA provided a number that 450,000 properties in the country are brownfields. And just for an example, in Rochester, New York, there are 1,000 to 3,000 properties that could be considered in the brownfield program. So here's the big question. What is environmental due diligence? It's a procedure that evaluates the possible risk on land properties for environmental contamination, specifically in groundwater and soil contamination. So I'm talking about underneath the ground, dirty dirt, fun geology, fun stuff. And all of our standards are specific to EPA regulations and guidance. They just updated them November of 2022. So a lot of our projects are being looked at because the EPA just changed all the guidance. I like to kind of show this slide here because the business case for environmental issues, people don't consider this when they're buying a property or they're looking to like start a new business and there's a piece of property involved. The property could be $1 million. Maybe it's in downtown area and the people want to turn it into a brewery, very simple thing. Well, even though the property is appraised to be, you know, $1 million, they're not considering the environmental cleanup and the impact that that can take. So these additional costs can really affect the overall price of that property. There's also the CERCLA legal cause, which basically allows an innocent landowner, if they complete their due diligence, which is an environmental phase 1, to say, hey, this site is contaminated. It's not my problem, right? Like I wasn't the one who caused this contamination. It was ExxonMobil, it was Kodak, it was Xerox. It was someone who actually came in and contaminated the ground. The phase 1 allows them in a court to show this. It's kind of like mineral rights. Once you buy a property and there's environmental concern, you're on the hook for cleaning it up with the DEC and the EPA. So environmental due diligence, just to kind of give you guys like an idea, I primarily specialize in phase 1s, and this cute little GIS map, Justin, don't look, sorry, is all of the phase 1s that I've done since 2016 throughout the country. So I manage over 1,000 projects a year. These go, sometimes they go into phase 2 investigations, sometimes they go into remedial investigations, and then the last step is ongoing monitoring. I do apologize, it's not the best slide I could have made, but this was at 10 o'clock last night, so. And just kind of giving you an idea of what types of projects I do. It's not just property and real estate, it's a lot of corridor studies. With downtown grants, they require phase 1s, especially if they want to revitalize or make their neighborhoods look nicer and get government money, they require phase 1s. Obviously with buildings and property, real estate, I do construction phase 1s, I do developing phase 1s, I do financing phase 1s. I do get calls about sites that are environmentally impaired, so we got to go in there and figure out how impacted they are. It's a big, those are the fun ones because they actually want to clean up the properties. And then a lot of work I do is for utility and renewable development here in New York State. I work with RG&E and Avangrid, National Grid, and NYSEG, updating all of the power systems to make everything work with all the new renewables that are coming in, but also with renewable developers. There's a ton of solar development in New York State that's occurring. Their financiers are requiring phase 1s, and they're doing them on old landfills. They're doing them on farms. So we have to make sure when they're putting these massive solar sites on there that they're not digging into environmentally impacted sites, so their people are safe. But also if it is environmentally contaminated, like an old landfill, how they can properly install those type of solar type work. So to start out, the phase 1 ESA has multiple different pieces to it, and I like to consider it as like a detective. So you go in, we're going to look at regulatory record reviews, so New York State DEC, EPA, listings with the property and the surrounding area. We're going to do historical research. We're going to look at old maps, old aerials, old street directories to show you or show us if there could be an environmental issue. We'll do interviews with the owners, past owners, neighbors, to see if they have any information. Sometimes we have to call like the old guy that's lived on his farm for 60 years to figure out there's a farm dump, and they're usually the best contact because they're pretty irritable. And then we also have to look at government records. And then the last piece is we actually go on site and see, what does this property look like right now? What are the current operations? Who's occupying the site? Some non-scope items that we do include in our reports, regulated building materials. So think like lead-based paint, asbestos, radon. We also consider wetlands and endangered species in our reports. I have a whole separate division within LaBella that specializes in wetlands and delineations and endangered species. I'm not an expert in that world at all, but that is something that we can incorporate into our reports. Emerging contaminants, that's a big one for us right now, working with PFAS and 1,4-dioxane, which is in everybody's groundwater. And then also climate resiliency. So when we have people coming in, like from New York City or in the Carolinas or in Alabama, they're worried is their development going to be caused by flooding or hurricanes or really anything that the climate is happening now. So we do a lot of those cool studies to see what is going to happen in 10, 20, 50 years to their properties. So real quick, I'm going to show you in a snapshot what phase 1 is involved in. This is a regulatory review. This is a database report we get from a third party. Actually, the gentleman who helps me with this is also a Alfred graduate. And this is all listings of properties within a mile. We have to see within a mile if properties are contaminating our sites. So we click on it. It tells us, yeah, there was a gas station here. This is what it typically looks like. It outlines if there were an underground storage tank was removed, if spills occurred, and we have to kind of figure out what contamination was there and was it cleaned up properly. Sometimes the records we have isn't great, and then we have to kind of go further and dig deeper, and we have to look at EPA or New York State DEC records. This is an example of a site I was working on. Can I use this mouse? Oh yeah, I can, cool. So the property I was looking at was right here. There was a massive Superfund site south of this property. The area in red, area C, was very hot. That's what we like to say when there's a lot of contamination in the ground. And so we were looking at this property that had the site a couple blocks away that was causing contamination with an entire neighborhood. And we had to figure out how it was affecting our property. And it ended up being a massive court case where this whole neighborhood had to go back to the people who were in charge of cleaning up this property, and they had to have what we call vapor intrusion systems installed in all their homes so they weren't breathing in the contamination. Historical is really fun. This is probably my favorite part. These are called Sanborn Fire Insurance Maps. They were created back in the 1800s, and they're still created. I think the latest ones are from 2012. And they're exactly what they sound like. They were made for insurance purposes. So back in the day, people would go in, they would draw these old drawings to show where staircases were, what buildings were there, what was in the buildings. So if there was a fire, they could go back, look at the drawings, they could figure out how much the insurance cost would be. They're great now for my type of work. Specifically, if you look here, this is an old gas station. It shows that there was greasing on the property, and then there's these fun little circles. Those are what we call underground storage tanks, and they're found everywhere. Lots of people use them for heating or for dispensing type of fuels, and so it's very common for us to find these type of tanks on these drawings and then going out there and actually finding a tank underground. This is just a fun map. This is in downtown Rochester, and it shows on the left side that this was General Motors construction. This is now an EPA Superfund site in the city of Rochester. But it shows you like they had degreasing where they did their car manufacturing, where they did their repair for the oil cars, where they did the oil changes. It goes down, you can see, it's kind of hard, I'm sorry, but over here there's a subway and the Erie Canal. In New York State, back in the day when they filled up the Erie Canal, it was, I swear, the government mayors and everything were just like, come on, like bring all your trash and throw it in the canal. So whenever we see a canal, we know that there's probably going to be contamination or ash or fill. So if we do see that, that's a good area for us to investigate. And then it just kind of goes back in. There's another gas station here, another gas station. So these drawings are just really helpful for us. Historical aerials are great. Those Sanborn maps only really cover urban areas. So sometimes we have to go to the next resource, which would be a historical aerial. In this picture in 2018, you see there's a gas station. There's an area where dispensing is going on. This area here, where the concrete is, this patch, this is where underground storage tanks are. There's lines that goes up to the dispensers. And when we were looking at this property, we noticed in 1970 that everything was kind of moved around. The dispensing units were in a different place. The tanks were in a different place. So we went out there, we investigated the property, and we found, I think it was like 3 vacant orphaned tanks that nobody could remember that they were there. So, and a ton of contamination. So we ended up removing, I think it was like 140 cubic yards of contaminated soil. And then we had to remove the vacant, the vacant tanks that were left there. Street directories. When we're looking at those old Sanborn maps, sometimes the street directories, the street names changes, the addresses have changed, or sometimes they're not very clear. They just say S, which would mean store. So we're like, okay, who occupied this property? So we'll go in and we'll look at old street directories. This one is just like crazy. So I wanted to show everyone. Dry cleaning was here. Tool machine shop was next door. Down the road, they had BB Motors, a service center, an auto sales facility, holiday sales. Maybe it was for Christmas. Maybe it was car sales. Who knows? Then we have precision and grinding, and then printers. And these are all issues because specifically with dry cleaning, the chemicals that they used are really, really heavy in the ground. They actually go underneath groundwater. And they expand crazy. So they're very difficult to clean up. And when we see a dry cleaner, we know that there's going to be a pretty extensive cleanup that's going to occur because they just keep going down and down. They'll eat bedrock, and they'll go into the groundwater and just go everywhere. Same with machine, tool and die shops. A lot of the cleaning uses that they have chlorinated solvents, which are what dry cleaners have. They also have petroleum products, which are nasty to clean up. Think of like gasoline, oils, that kind of stuff. Also go into the ground, and they like to spread. When we're really in a pinch and we don't have any aerials or any street directories or anything like that, we'll look at historical topographic maps. This happens a lot in our Pennsylvania sites because they're in the middle of nowhere and we just have no records. This is a site we were hired by Fairgrounds for a municipality. They wanted to sell their fairgrounds and move it to a different location. And as we were looking at these topographic maps, we saw that there was a gravel pit on one of the old maps. I think it was like 1950s or 60s. And then the next couple of years, we see this brown area. Turns out when this was a gravel pit, the municipality allowed everyone to come in, bring all their garbage, and basically use it like a landfill. So all the areas that are in brown were the areas where people were allowed to do landfilling. And obviously now the municipality has a massive issue on their hands because they have an old landfill that they can't sell. Town records, really quickly, this just kind of shows you whenever there's a development occurring, there has to be building permits that get put in. So a lot of times when we're doing freedom of information requests and we're reviewing information, we'll go through and we'll see this like under 10,000 gallon underground storage tanks were installed or removed. And it's kind of fun because you say, okay, well, in 1930, it says 6 tanks were removed. And in 1990, it says 2 tanks were removed. Where are the other 4 tanks? So this kind of allows us to see a brief history of the property and development. So we go on and we look at, so now we have a pretty good, clear indication of what's going on the site. We've looked at our regulatory records. We've looked at the history. Now we go on site and we try to look like what's going on at the property. This is pretty easy. I find these once a week on a site. vent pipes and fill ports for tanks, above ground or underground. I have a little description here showing what an underground storage tank looks like. This is the vent pipe, vents the tank, obviously. Here's the fill port where a truck can come in and fill it up. Also on site inspections, these are pictures that I actually took as an analyst. This is just, I went out to the site, they knew I was coming out and they just didn't care. There was 55-gallon drums leaking all over the place. You can see the ground here is just black from oils that they just allowed to leak. And then the other picture was a site that I went out on. Again, they just improper storage. They had 5-gallon drums, buckets of oil just open. So those were leaking all over the place. And those were definitely issues that we had to call out. So the phase one is where we identify if there's an environmental concern. We're worried about underground and above ground storage tanks. We're worried about automobile repair. We're worried about dry cleaners, manufacturing, landfilling, printing, pesticide application, old orchards. A lot of nowadays, people are doing like crazy developments, especially down south on old ag farms with orchards. And we're just working on a site now where we have to remove 18 feet of contaminated soil before they even build a house there because of the amount of arsenic and lead that was left over from the pesticides. Printing and photo developing, anyone from Rochester knows Kodak. The photo developing is just nasty stuff, fun stuff for us to clean up. In-ground lifts, septic systems, oil water separators. Think like an old auto repair facility that has a floor drain that just goes to a septic system. That happens a lot. Paper mills, metal plating, coal gas plants, and then blacksmiths. People are probably like, what? Back in the 1800s, some of the metals that they use, they're just heavy metals and they don't leave the ground. So we have to go on there and just remove them. All right, you guys doing okay? Feel like I'm talking. Okay. The phase one, so like I said, is what we identify the issues. So the next step in the due diligence process is the phase two. And that's where we go out and we actually see what can we find there? What is there a tank? Is there contamination? So this is where we go out. We'll find, like in this example here, the mapping showed that there was a tank there. We went out, we found a tank there. So they're really the guys that get to do the fun field type of work. This is just kind of some examples showing you that was a 10,000-gallon tank being removed that we identified in phase one. That picture in the snow is a test pitting where we go out and take excavators and do some test pits, and the ground was black. It smelled horrible. So we knew that there was contamination in the ground. Another piece of phase two work that we do is called soil vapor intrusion testing. So in this figure down here, you see that there's a building. The orange area, that is what that's where contamination can be underneath the building. It happens. And so instead of having our clients pay all this money to go and remove the building so that they can go out and remove all the soils, what we're mainly concerned about in those situations is human health, making sure that people aren't going to be breathing in the contaminated air from the ground. So we put in an air system, very similar to a radon system. We install two or three, or how many we need, holes basically into the ground. It sucks up the air from the contamination so the people aren't breathing in the vapors. It goes up to the roof with a fan and then it just gets vented out. So people aren't breathing in the contamination underneath the ground. These are great, great systems. Okay. So here is my little fun timeline of a project that we've been working on. It started as a phase one and is now a brownfield. So the site was developed for the use of manufacturing of contact lenses. Everyone wears them. I'm wearing them. And in 2008, owner called LaBella and said, hey, I want to buy this property. Can you do a phase one? Which went on to a phase two, which went on to remedial work, which we found a lot of contamination, turned it into a brownfield, and there's still ongoing monitoring today. I'm going to go through this whole timeline for you. So a purchaser is looking to buy or refinance property. The bank says, hey, you need to do phase one. The phase one identified RCRA EPA listings showing that it was a hazardous generator of chemicals, and it had lots of historical uses of issues. Basically, it had underground storage tanks. City of Rochester records showed large manufacturing type work, lots of tanks installed and removed. There was an active New York State DEC spill that was open for 10 years that nobody at the DEC really knew why it was still open or active. And then our sandboard maps showed an area where there was a lot of manufacturing going on, like lots of manufacturing. So we went out there and we did a phase two. We did 9 test pits, included soil borings, soil samples, and we found when we went out there that there was PCBs, heavy metals, chlorinated solvents, petroleum. I mean, it had like everything on the site. And then in the groundwater, we also found pretty high levels of VOCs, which we call volatile organic compounds, that is identified with the New York State DEC as issues. Petroleum impacts were found in about half of our testing locations. TCE was found at low levels, but when we were doing our sampling, our drillers couldn't get further, so the bedrock was really, really high, and the sampling for the soils was really, like, there wasn't very much, so we really couldn't tell how bad the TCE was in the groundwater because of the bedrock. But based on what we found, we told the owner, hey, we found a lot of contamination here. You have to tell the DEC. So we told the DEC. The DEC said, well, you got to clean it up. And we were hired to do the cleanup. The brownfield cleanup program process. So we talked to the owner and we said, hey, we think this is a great, great property for the brownfield program. And this is just kind of like a map of the process. We first have to go out there. We have to see how much contamination is there. Does the DEC think that it's good enough to be a brownfield? There's only a certain amount of money that's allowed in the brownfield program. So we have to basically show there's enough contamination for the program to accept the site. We had to do extensive then you do your remedial investigation. You do remedial measures and engineering controls to ensure that the contamination is cleaned up. You do a final remedy, and then the DEC says, yep, you're good, and usually it follows up with continuous monitoring. Sorry, a little too far. So in the remedial investigation, we first have to figure out where utilities are. So where's water, where's electric, because we can't drill into those things. We do what we call a geophysical survey, which I'll show you in the next slide. Those are really cool, but that's where we're looking for anomalies. So if we're going to find an empty underground storage tank, that's how we're going to find it. Well, we did test pitting, we did soil vapor intrusion testing, we did soil gas testing. We kind of did a lot of different things here. This is what a GPR looks like. So we basically have a guy go out, he's wearing, it looks like a backpack. He walks the site back and forth, and he does, it basically comes up like this. This is what it looks like, and we can be able to tell where there's anomalies. So these big areas that are yellow, that's how we could kind of tell that there could be potentially tanks or some sort of anomaly that's in the ground. So we went out there and we had to start with the first environmental impacts, which is we went out and we did a ton of sampling all over the site, and we ended up having to remove 1,650 tons of impacted soils, and we placed them in a biocell. While we were removing those soils, we found a 500-gallon Orphan UST that was completely full. We had to put in recovery wells because, like I said, the bedrock was so high. We had to put in new wells, and then we had to continuously be testing for TCE because we just had a feeling that it was there. So these are what test pits look like. This is that 500-gallon underground storage tank that we found. It came out like that. It was just punctured, but it was leaking and it was so gross. These are what soil borings look like, just with the samples that we took. This was our confirmatory sampling. So we went in, we did all those massive test pits, and we have to do what's called confirmatory sampling. So once we're done taking out all the soil from the ground, we have to be able to say, yes, it's clean. So the DEC says, like, can check our work. So we had to take confirmatory sampling after we removed all the soil. These are recovery wells. These were really cool. These had to go into the bedrock. They're very expensive, but we had to basically drill into the bedrock with a very specific drill to make sure that we were checking the groundwater and seeing how much chlorinated solvents were in them. Yeah, and so we ended up putting 4 bedrock wells. And when we tested the bedrock groundwater, what we found was in one well, there was 2,000 parts per billion of TCE, which the New York State DEC standard is 5. So that was massive and large. Here's the bedrock samples that we got to take, which was pretty cool. We don't get to see those very often. Yeah, so this just kind of gives you an idea of where we're at so far. We did the recovery wells, we did the bedrock wells, we did soils removals, and we removed an underground storage tank. The next step we had to do was look at the building itself, because they were thinking that they were going to allow people to live here. They were going to make this an affordable housing. So we had to install a subslab depressurization system. We had to put in multiple suction points just to make sure that people weren't going to be breathing in the contamination. This is just what a drawing looks like of an SSDS system. The red points are like the suction areas, and the green is where the piping is. And this is how we connect the interior and exterior so it goes out into the top of the building. So the DEC required us to test 5 locations weekly for 4 weeks. Then we had to test it monthly for a year. Then we had to test it quarterly for 3 years. And now we only have to test it yearly, but we have to ensure that the system is still working and that the engineering controls that we have are still in place. This is just a map showing of all the areas that we sampled on the site and continue to sample. So our first area, we had to remove tons more soil. We had to do bedrock excavations. We had to do confirmatory sampling. We had to remove 32,000 gallons of water from the site because it was so impacted with contamination. And then we had to put in the bedrock wells to see how bad they were in the bedrock. Here's another fun photo. Okay, so we get done with that. We go to the DEC. We say, okay, this is what we've done. The DEC is like, you have to do so much more. So we go back out there and try to figure out the extent of the contamination. We remove even more cubic yards of soil and have to determine the areas that wasn't contaminated. We had to figure out that that could go in one pile on site that they could reuse, and then the other had to go to a landfill. Then we had to remove another 28,000 gallons of water because it was still super contaminated. We had to do the sampling like we always do after we do the excavations. And then we had to install even more wells to figure out where the groundwater had been expanding with their contamination. We ended up finding 3 more areas where there was contaminated soils, along with 100 more gallons of water that had to be pumped and treated before it could go to the sewer. So now we started in that one area. Now, as you're looking out into the property, you're seeing even more areas where there's sources of contamination. This is just a kind of a cool 3D model showing like where the source of the contamination is. The green area is just a massive area that we had to remove from the site. That's what it looks like. That's like where the pocket of contamination is. So we called the DEC and they said, okay, you guys have been doing a lot of work out here. What we need you to do is you need to remove 2 feet from the site and put clean soil there. Then you have to cover that soil with an asphalt parking lot so nobody can get to the impacted soils. And then on top of that, you're gonna have to put concrete floor slabs in the buildings so nobody can get into it. We also had to, in our bedrock wells, because the contamination, even though we were pumping it out, the contamination was so deep in the bedrock that we actually had to go through and what we call put in situ chemical reduction. So it basically puts a specific like cleaning solution in the groundwater, expands in and basically eats away at the contaminated water. We had to do that multiple times to make sure it was clean. And then we had to install the SSDS system to reduce VOCs in the indoor air. We also had to have a site management plan installed with the DEC. So if anyone were to come in and remove the building or do something for redevelopment, they have to follow all of these engineering controls because people will be digging in contaminated soils. So this is just kind of showing you that. So these areas are where we put in that solution in the groundwater to clean it up. All the areas in blue are where we had to basically put in the system or the solution. And we actually still have to do this yearly to make sure that the groundwater isn't being impacted. So kind of fun stuff. Sorry, I'm kind of rushing through stuff. This is what the system looks like when we're installing it. There's different areas of containment. We go in, there's a monitoring well here, this little black area. We pump in the solution, and then it just kind of works itself out. This is one of our guys on site pumping it into the well, kind of cool. And we have to, we have to routinely watch the El Napo contaminated pollutant that's still on site. We have to monitor it, and we get to remove as necessary. So we go back out there every year, we do the same solution, and then we monitor it to see how our bugs are doing, basically. This is just paperwork from the DEC showing that there's an environmental easement granted. There's all these restrictions for the property. The property cannot be used for residential purposes. People can't live there. People can work there, but they can't live there. And there's no, like, you can't put a garden there. You can't, there's lots of like things that you can't do. The DEC won't let you do it. So what's left at this site, we have to do routine groundwater sampling. Like I said, we have to monitor the contamination that's still in the ground. We have to monitor the SSDS system. We do routine indoor air sampling, and we have to make sure that the cover system, that 2 feet of soil and asphalt and concrete doesn't crack, with ice, and just make sure it's all in place still. So this site, I believe the monitoring has to go for another 50 years. So this is just job security on our side. So I guess I'll leave some time for questions, but, as a person in due diligence, it starts with doing an investigation like a detective, and then you get to move. If the people here who like to do field work, you can go out, you can do all the sampling, you can work with the heavy equipment. And then there's also the engineering aspect where we go in and we figure out these engineering controls and remedial ways so that these properties, which are brown and thought to be never could be used again, can actually be redeveloped and be reused. So it's a really cool, cool job I got. Thanks. Michelle? Yeah. So the responsible parties were Bosch and Lom. I'm allowed to say that. So they did get some money from them in a court case. The person bought the property for $0, didn't buy it, and he put in himself $1.2 million for the cleanup. The brownfield program in New York State DEC, although we put that much money in, he does not have to pay property taxes on the property for, I think it's like 25 years. So it does come back if you have a really good, I don't know, attorney, and you have a really good accountant, it makes sense. But these things are very expensive. And especially when you get put on the hook for it, you don't really have an option. You have to clean it up. Yes. Yep, it's all through the brownfield program. Yeah, and we were worried that the brownfield program was sunsetting in 2019, but the DEC, the governor signed it so that this could still place. Yes. Well, there's lobbying, where we actually have a government affairs person within LaBella that works with lobbyists to ensure that these type of programs support funding. We tend to do most of our work in states that are willing to go with more environmental, and not as Republican conservatives don't, when they say we don't want to do this. We do a lot of government research on another aspect in our company that really focuses on that and allows us to determine where we should be putting our offices and the type of work that we should be going after. Did I answer your question? I don't know if I did.
So if you had to, this whole situation was in a different state, it would be completely different.
Yes.
I suspect New York is probably one of the states where it's possibly complicated.
New York, California, or North Carolina are the states that we tend to do more. Well, not California, but New York and the Carolinas are primarily where we do a lot of this work. Virginia's getting there. They're new. We're kind of watching what's going on with policy there. But like in Pennsylvania, they have an Act 2 program, but it's not as strenuous or financially accommodating as the other programs. Yeah, thanks guys.
If your boss told you